Because folks, teaching schedules might kick in, and we don't want the room to clear out before Jenny's had a chance to finish her talk. I want to give us a hearty welcome, please, to Jenny Lin, one of our candidates in modern and contemporary art and art history. Thank you all so much for coming. This is an unusual time for talks, so I know this is a little bit outside of folks' expectations for time. Jenny is a PhD candidate in contemporary Chinese art at UCLA and will be defending her dissertation in June of this year. So she's essentially complete, although she might not feel that way exactly at this moment. I remember what that feels like. And the title of her dissertation is Above Sea, Modern and Contemporary Art from the Ruins of Shanghai's New Heaven and Earth. She also, she has an MA also from UCLA and a BA from Brown University in Architectural Studies and Italian Studies. So her work, in other words, is quite distinctly interdisciplinary. She also took translation studies and did dissertation research at Fudan University in Shanghai. So she has quite a bit of international experience. She is teaching at UCLA, or taught at UCLA in the summer of 2011, and is currently teaching at Cal State San Bernardino. So please welcome Jenny Lin. Welcome to Chicago.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, everybody. Ooh. Sorry. Will you adjust that? Okay. Thank you, everybody. I'm very happy to be here. And I brought the sunshine from LA with me, so hope you enjoy it. So I'm going to give a talk about primarily my dissertation research and give you an overview of it because I want to leave enough time so that we can also have a Q&A session. So I'm going to kind of broadly introduce it, and then hopefully we can get into some more specifics that you guys are interested in after the talk. Okay. So China has, of course, as we all know, I think it's no secret, recently ascended to world status as a real global player. And this has all happened in the past 2 decades, since 1989 and China's so-called post-socialist development. This development can be characterized chiefly by the phenomenon of urbanization. And I'm just going to read you a quote culled from the Committee on Global Thought at Columbia University. By 2025, China is expected to have 15 supercities with an average population of 25 million each. Europe and North America will have none. So in China, Shanghai is arguably the city that has undergone the most urbanization, not only in the past 2 decades, but throughout the 20th century, and the most volatile changes. Shanghai, which is on the coast, and its name literally translates into above sea, that's the title of my dissertation, is unique because it's China's largest metropolis and its financial capital. And it's also, since the mid-19th century, after it was thrust open as a treaty port following Britain's victory in the Opium Wars, considered as China's most so-called East meets West city, and the seat of a particularly cultural hybrid form of modernity. This is often cited in relationship, for instance, to the fact that the word for modern in Chinese, modern, was transliterated from the English and French versions, moderne and modern, in Shanghai itself. And so the idea of Chinese modernity kind of always conjured the city and these East meets West encounters. So my research seeks to deconstruct the trope of East meets West by uncovering diverging models of modernity that engaged more complex modes of cultural hybridity, as well as sometimes cross-cultural collisions. And I look at examples of art, film, and architecture, all of which took urban Shanghai as its conceptual framework for formulating new ideas of Chinese modernity in 3 key periods throughout the 20th century. The first is the 1920s to the 30s, which is considered Shanghai's modernist heyday and the time at which its semi-colonialism was at its apex. The second period that I look to is the 60s and 70s during the Cultural Revolution. And the third period I look at is the 1990s to the present, as Shanghai has reemerged as a global center of art, design, and finance. My analyses of case studies reveal social, political, and economic conflicts that also could have been said to characterize Shanghai in each of these periods, such as debates between semi-colonialism and imported capitalism in the 1920s to the 30s, visions of socialism as opposed to capitalism in the 1960s to 70s, and a cut-off of foreign trade and exchange, and local identities and issues of globalization in the 90s to the present. So I begin in the 1920s to the 30s, which, like I said, is usually referred to as Shanghai's modernist heyday. It was the time in which foreign powers came into Shanghai and were at their greatest population, and also carved the city up into a number of foreign concessions, British and American run, French run, the French concession, as well as Japanese run. Of course, this time is now often mythologized and idealized, but it was also a time of great disparity and inequality between colonizers and colonized, as well as between classes, and a time of revolutionary struggle. So we see that this is kind of most often harkened back to now, especially in contemporary China, as it seeks to set itself apart from its colonial past. In the anecdote that when the Bund Park opened in Shanghai in 1868 in the international settlement, there was a sign at the entrance to the park that said, "No dogs and no Chinese allowed." At the same time, the foreign concessions, later in the 1930s, when Japanese bombing started in Shanghai, they became places of the immense influx of refugees that were coming from war-torn China, all over provinces all over China, as well as different neighborhoods that were being bombed at the time. So my research is really focused around one particular neighborhood, which is the French concession, and is known to be the epitomizing neighborhood of Shanghai and its East meets West identity. Here you can see Avenue Joffre in the map that runs through as the central boulevard of the French concession. In 1921, it was the site of the first communist meeting in which Mao Zedong, as well as intellectuals, many of them who had studied in Paris, were coming back into China and trying to import ideas of Marxism into figuring new directions for Chinese society. It was also a hotbed of revolutionary art activity, and the location of the site of the studio of China's first avant-garde art collective, the Storm Society, which set up shop here in 1930. So this is the Storm Society. You see some of its key members here. In the top left-hand corner, kind of his head just peeking out in a long white robe, is the artist Peng Xuanqin, who had studied for 5 years in Paris and had just moved back to Shanghai and wanted to import ideas of avant-garde aesthetic tactics as well as modernist ones into formulating new notions of Chinese modernity. So I'll just read you a couple quotes from their manifesto. "The air around us is too still, as mediocrity and vulgarity continue to envelop us. Where are the glories of our history? Since the beginning of the 20th century, a new atmosphere has emerged in the European artistic community, comprised of the outcries of the Fauvists, the twists of the Cubists, the vehemence of the Dadaists, and the cravings of the Surrealists. It is time for a new atmosphere to emerge throughout the 20th century artistic community of China. Let us rise up with our raging passion and iron intellect. We'll create a world interwoven with color, line, and form." So they took a really revolutionary approach to the way in which they considered art practice. This is one work that kind of epitomizes the way in which they also utilized Shanghai itself as an urban terrain for figuring out these ideas of Chinese modernity. So this is Peng Xuanqin's Such is Shanghai, also called The Riddle of Life, 如是 Shanghai in Chinese. And this is a watercolor that's fashioned as a collage, integrating techniques that Peng Xuanqin had just studied in Paris, collage, culled from Surrealism as well as Dada that he was engaged in studying there. And it attempts to create a multi-layered portrait of the city that is not necessarily one of only East meets West harmonious encounters, but also ones in which the allures of the city are juxtaposed against the potential dangers of it. So you see kind of enticing, beautiful Chinese women in the bottom right-hand corner, in the upper left-hand corner. Next to that, probably a white Russian who were known to fill the cabarets that were very popular in Shanghai at this time, as well as an opera performer in full makeup. Peng Xuanqin kind of gestures that there are these ideas of alluring enticements of the city, and then those are juxtaposed against symbols of danger, perhaps. In the upper right-hand corner, we see a dagger that looks like it's bloodied and plunging down into a dismembered body. In the lower left-hand corner, we see a fist clenching perhaps money and a candle, perhaps gesturing to the opium dens and the brothels that were very common during this time in Shanghai. There's also playing cards you see here. And in fact, the entire watercolor is kind of pictured as around a playing card's axis, yeah? Giving us the idea that perhaps Shanghai is not only a place of enticement, allure, but also a place where one could gamble and potentially lose one's money, or a place of corruption. The way in which the Storm Society has been discussed thus far is generally in relationship to the Dada and Surrealist utilization of collage. But my research also points to the fact that Peng Shuai-Chin was very engaged with the popular media and culture of the time, and in particular with Liang You, which is the popular lifestyle magazine of 1920s and 1930s Shanghai. The English title is The Young Companion Pictorial. And this was a chief kind of symbol of Shanghai modernity that I define as cosmopolitan, yeah? They use the icon of the Hollywood starlet, and as well as a layout that incorporates collage in order to picture Shanghai as this place of multiple layers. Simultaneously, from the same neighborhood that we were looking at, arises an alternative form of modernity, what I refer to as the anti-imperialist form. And this is led by the League of Left-Wing Artists, you can see up in the left-hand corner, especially by the revolutionary writer Lu Xun, who stands in the center of the group with the long robes. He, not unlike Peng Shuai-Chin, was educated abroad, but in Japan, and became revolutionized as a writer there. He was responsible for translating a lot of the Marxist literature that was circulating in Shanghai at this time. So Lu Xun was very instrumental in importing the idea of the woodcut and encouraging the woodcut to be the fundamental medium for which the League of Left-Wing Artists preached a Chinese form of modernity that was social critique. So here we see Hu Yichuan's To the Front of 1932, in which a young revolutionary rallies up against the bombing. This is in particular in reference to the recent bombing of the Jiabei district, the Japanese-run district in Shanghai of the time. So he really promoted expressionistic kind of tendencies culled from German examples, such as the work of Kathy Kollwitz. And I'll just read you one quote of Lu Xun on Kathy Kollwitz. Chinese who have not had an opportunity to travel abroad often have the idea that all white people are either preachers of Christianity or well-dressed, well-fed managers of business firms given to the habit of kicking people about when out of humor. But the works of Kollwitz show that there are others, injured and insulted, like us, in many places of the earth, on the earth, as well as artists who mourn, protest, and struggle on their behalf. So another League of Left-Wing artists is Cai Ruohong, who also made woodcuts, but in addition, he would make cartoons that circulated in the popular press and journals of the day. And this is one such cartoon, Avenue Joffre, which pictures, when I showed you the map of the French Concession, this is the major high street of the French Concession. But instead of being depicted as this glamorous place of commercial, imported foreign goods and capitalism, it's also shown as a place of real conflict. So you see perhaps one of those well-fed business managers in the center, a foreigner who is obviously rich and carrying a fat bag, juxtaposed against a poor, nearly starvingly skinny young boy who is next to a dog, kind of likened to him. You also see a foreign police. The districts had their own police forces, so you see a foreign police officer incarcerating a local Chinese person unfairly and unjustly, and probably a prostitute here in the front who, unlike the kind of the cosmopolitan idea of this beautiful, alluring, enticing the Shanghainese modern woman, we see a kind of a hardened looking figure, probably alluding more to the poverty that was the reality of the time. We see these kind of tactics used the most frequently in the films of the era. In 1930s, Shanghai was really the capital of cinema in the entire Asian region. So one key work, which also came out of the League of Left-Wing Artists, the League of Left-Wing Filmmakers, was this film Street Angel by the director Yuan Muzhi. And Street Angel tells the story of a young woman, the protagonist, who's a beautiful singer, songstress, and she almost gets sold into slavery by her evil and corrupt landlords. So luckily, some working class young revolutionary neighbors help her to get out of this predicament. So the film actually starts with a montage, and I want to just play it for you now, which pictures Shanghai as this place of collisions, but then also goes on to utilize narrative to give a multifaceted portrait of the city. These are the opening credits, so that's what you see running as the titles and the different actors who are instrumental in the film. So now you can see these international parks also welcome to upper-class Chinese citizens as well. Right. So despite the key kind of differences and divergences between this anti-imperialist and cosmopolitan formulation of modernity that I analyze, there's also a lot of ways in which they overlap, namely in social critique and the utilization of techniques and tactics like collage and realism in the case of the anti-imperialist model in order to critique Shanghai and its modern realities. In the ensuing years, the anti-imperialist model was said to triumph, and I'll talk a little bit about that now. So let me just give you a brief overview, because I don't think there are too many people from Chinese studies here, are there? Okay, so really brief recap. In 1949, the Communist Party beats the Nationalist Party, who was involved in a bitter civil war just on the heels of World War II, but in China, the Japanese Sino War as well. So this is a time of major reconstruction when the Communist Party and Chairman Mao Zedong take power. In the late 50s, he launches the Great Leap Forward, which is a kind of attempt to very quickly collectivize all of the farming in China. And it results in a disaster with nearly 30 million people dying of starvation from famine. So in this horrific aftermath of the Great Leap Forward, and in an attempt to consolidate their power, Mao Zedong, together with Jiang Qing, his wife, and as well as some other allies, spearhead the Cultural Revolution. Yeah, and the Cultural Revolution can also be seen as a project of Chinese modernity aimed at ridding the country of what they consider its four olds: old habits, old ideas, old customs, and old thoughts, and old culture in particular, right? So the cultural hybridity that we see here most is the adoption of Soviet socialist realist models of production. But Shanghai in particular is singled out as being kind of the seat of imperial bourgeois culture in the Republican era China that we looked at last time. And thus it is kind of tackled as a place that needs to be changed and revolutionized. During this time period, the city gets covered over in dazeba, which are called big character posters that are proclaiming the greatness of Chairman Mao Zedong and the Communist Party, as well as denouncing anybody who's considered a rightist, including those artists like the people that we looked at, like Peng Shunqin and the Storm Society artists. Many of them are forced to destroy their works by their own hands, sent to labor camps, beaten publicly, beaten to death in some cases. So a very extreme time of wiping China of its olds and creating a culture from ground zero, so to speak. The icon of the movie starlet that we saw during much of the popular culture of 1920s, 30s Shanghai is reproduced by the icon of Mao Zedong, as well as beaming images of peasants, workers, and soldiers, who are then also considered to be artists. There's Mao Zedong issues a credo that says that everybody is an artist, yeah, and that artists should work together and collaborate with peasants, workers, and soldiers to create works all as revolutionary tools. So the French concession neighborhood in Shanghai that I looked at in the 1920s to 30s is now covered over with these daozabao, as well as murals proclaiming allegiance to Mao Zedong. And one cathedral, a French cathedral in particular, is converted into the Shanghai Oil Painting and Sculpture Institute. And there the students are primarily encouraged to paint murals of Mao Zedong, as well as go into labor factories and farms and work with laborers there to produce work. So this is one painting that is a result of such an effort called Trees of Fire and Flowers of Silver Under a Brilliantly Lit Night Sky. And a group of artists from the Shanghai Oil Painting and Sculpture Institute, at this time you never get individual names because it's all about collective authorship. They go into the dockyards and they depict the factories as this kind of bustling place of great industrial development and trying to depict Shanghai as a leader in industrialization. You also see in the background a banner that says Mao Zhu Wan, so long live Chairman Mao. So there's always constantly references to Mao. Funnily enough, the artists who I was able to speak with and read on, they talk about this as a collective work, but they admit that in the end, only one artist actually produced the work. And that artist also said that, his time spent in the dockyards, he was amazed by how much the people could make with so little in such poor conditions. But nonetheless, in these kind of officially approved works, they have to really produce celebratory images of society and socialist achievement in China during this period. In 1972, the Italian film director Michelangelo Antonioni was invited into China to film a documentary about it that would also, officials hoped, celebrate the country and its socialist achievement. What came out of his time spent there was Zhonghua China, which is China in Chinese, and then China in Italian. And it's a 4-hour-long documentary. I'm not going to screen it right now, but it's a 4-hour-long documentary that just takes a very realistic approach to depicting Chinese life, as well as utilizing Antonioni's long takes to depict things as they are, in his words, to show the truth. So when he travels to Shanghai, he also visits that first site of the Communist Congress in the old French concession. And there he spends some time tracing the steps of the revolutionaries during that meeting and ruminating on socialism as potentially a utopian alternative to the capitalism in the West and in Europe at the time. We also get depictions in Shanghai of the socialist, realist, heroic kind of statues and propaganda that were all over the city, as well as, like I said, these long takes of just very quotidian, everyday scenes of life and long close-ups on young children, as well as on poor people hauling trash throughout the street. Now, when the film came out, you see his depiction of the dockyards on the left. And when this film came out, it was decried by Zhang Qing and her allies and Mao Zedong as a bashing of socialist achievement. And it was supposed to be screened at the Venice Biennale, but its screening was abruptly halted and it became a big diplomatic debacle. And Antonioni was very hurt by this. He had no idea why. He said, I love the Chinese people. He had this maybe potentially Orientalist, problematic kind of relationship to China. But when we look at kind of this in his film in juxtaposition to the official works of the period, you can get a sense of how they're almost opposite visions of Shanghai and of socialism in this period. So these works on the right are from the revolutionary Peking opera On the Docks, Haigang, which tells the story of a very successful dock worker brigade who they run into a problem by some evil feudalist man taint some of the sacks of rice that they're supposed to send to Africa with glass, but they discover the culprit and they are able to triumph over this evil feudalist capitalist man and send the sacks of grain to India successfully. To Africa successfully. So you get the feeling for these are the kinds of official works that were produced during the time. And Antonioni, when he, right after he had got back from China, he commented on the officials all brought him to very pre-established scenes and only allowed him to take particular shots. And he commented, "It is propaganda, but it is not a lie." But I also want to argue that the official art of the Cultural Revolution very much was a lie that kind of idealized heroes and prosperous trade while masking poor working conditions and international ties that had mostly all been severed. During the Cultural Revolution, officials also constantly hearkened back to that anti-imperialist model of the 1920s to 30s that I talked about, and to Lu Xuan's writing in particular as the key model that fueled their idea of aesthetics. But of course, we also see this kind of really idealized, heroic portrait of everyday people, unlike the anti-heroes that Lu Xuan found so compelling in the work of artists like Kathy Kollwitz. Perhaps we find that kind of anti-heroic realism more in a work like Antonioni's Zhonghua China. Okay, so again, to kind of recap what happens in the interim before I start on to my third and final case studies, which are of the 1990s to the present, as Shanghai has risen up and reascended as a global capital. So diplomatic ties had already begun improving the same year that Antonioni comes to China. Nixon famously comes to China and starts talks with that after Mao Zedong's death in 1976 really take fruition when Deng Xiaoping, the then leader of China, welcomes foreign trade into China. Yeah? And Shanghai goes through the most dramatic changes beginning in the year 1990. That's when the entire eastern side of the Huangpu River, which is a river that runs through China. Here you can see a model. This is from the Exhibition Planning Center in Shanghai. The entire eastern half of the city on the other side of the river is annexed into Shanghai as part of Shanghai, which increases the size by 6 times and effectively becomes the financial capital of the city and of China and now of the world, becoming of the world. So they invited free trade. It's called a special economic zone, which means that foreign firms and corporations are able to come in and free markets are able to take place without any governmental intervention. The French concession neighborhood that we've been looking to so far is now transformed into a retail and entertainment complex and also a cultural heritage site called Xintiandi, which translates into New Heaven on Earth, which thus is the title of my talk. Xintiandi, what happened was that the architects, originally Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill was on as the chief architectural firm of the project, and it was with a Hong Kong-based developer. And they wanted to kind of raise the entire neighborhood. They had all these old-style 1920s to 30s shukumen, which are stone gate homes that are the vernacular of Shanghai and semi-colonial in their design. They wanted to raise all of those and build up, a giant couple of skyscrapers and fill them with luxury boutiques and the shopping malls that we get around the world, right? The head developer had something different in mind, so he invited other architects to come and pitch ideas. And a small firm based out of Boston called Wood and Zapata wound up winning the bid. And what they did was still, yes, demolish many of the existing vernacular architecture, dislocating about 8,000 people. And then they reconstructed them, utilizing some of the same facades into kind of a simulacrum style shopping mall that were then filled with fancy boutiques. This is the other side of Xintiandi, which is called its Tomorrow, and that has a fancy upscale shopping complex. But then its Yesterday has the old style architecture of the 1920s to 30s. So you get these kinds of juxtapositions of the founding of the communist headquarters site juxtaposed against a Starbucks coffee. These kinds of things that seem to us very incongruous. In fact, the whole development project was able to take place because local Chinese officials were interested in preserving this museum of the site of the first communist meeting as a museum for when officials came to visit the site. They wanted it to look cleaned up around there. So you get these kinds of juxtapositions that, like I said, seem odd to us, but have increasingly become kind of a reality of contemporary Chinese life, and life in Shanghai in particular. Xintiandi is also this kind of vocabulary of using a local Shanghainese architecture and in order to promote international consumption or global brands and global trade has really taken off within China, and so you get all these kinds of other projects. Shihu Tiandi is one in Hangzhou. That's a similar idea of utilizing the local architecture and then to integrate shopping, international shopping. And Xintiandi also is kind of capitalizes on that 1920s to 30s past that I identified as the cosmopolitan model of modernity, claiming that this site is one in which art and life meet in design and also in reality in consumption. So you get Xintiandi hosting an annual arts festival, which invites public artists to produce works. You have one of the old colonial mansions that is preserved is turned into a VIP clubhouse and gallery. And you also get public fountains as well as temporary public sculpture sponsored by corporations like these Budweiser sculptures you see here. Within Xintiandi, the key retailer that also kind of epitomizes what Xintiandi's aims are is Shanghai Tang, which is a fashion brand and company run by Sir David Tang of Hong Kong, who consequently is the most key figure in promoting contemporary Chinese art abroad, one of the key collectors. Anyway, so Shanghai Tang is located in Xintiandi, and it utilizes also this nod to the 1920s to 30s glamorous modernist heyday of Shanghai to promote contemporary fashions and to promote contemporary Shanghainese identity abroad. So in this advertisement, we see Gong Li, who is a famous movie actress. Yes, have you guys heard of her? Raise the Red Lantern. She became famous, and she was the first kind of famous actress to get international acclaim and reception after 1989. Yeah, and so she becomes this kind of figure and icon of internationalism and transnationalism. And this, I would say, is what defines contemporary Chinese modernity as it is configured in Shanghai. It's this idea of transnationalism and fluidity of moving beyond cultures and of promoting still Chineseness abroad. So it's cultural anthropologists Aiwa Ong and Ananya Roy have talked about as this kind of worlding, yeah? A positioning of Shanghai and the city internationally as one of international prestige and cosmopolitan savvy. Yeah, we can talk more about this. We also have, the complications of the juxtaposition of her and perhaps a servant or a lowly cook, kind of hearkening back in a soft way to those social economic tensions that we saw in the 1920s to the 30s. So many contemporary works kind of embrace this idea of worlding Shanghai and are even as devices to help in this process. So one such work is Gu Wenda's Heavenly Lantern Project. This is a projection. He has not built this yet, but he hopes to cover the Jinmao Tower, which is located in Pudong, the eastern region of Shanghai, and a symbol of modernity as this imported skyscraper done by Skidmore, Owings & Merrill. He wants to cover the entire skyscraper with red Chinese lanterns. In order to, as he says, quote, celebrate the multiple cultures in our modern society by erecting a series of large-scale works in a unique and grand manner full of Chinese cultural symbolism. So he wants to export this project all over the world, into Hong Kong. This is a project to cover the Hotel Belvedere, where the annual World Economic Forum is held in Davos. This one in the upper left-hand corner did just debut in the Europalia Festival in Brussels, in which he covered an architectural monument in these lanterns and created a tea house to promote Chinese identity abroad. My research, however, kind of tries to move beyond those cliches of the superficial level of the East meets West trope by looking really carefully at Gu Wenda's modes of production, his utilization of local Chinese factories to produce the lanterns, his team of architects, designers, laborers that help him to produce the work. So in this way, I'm thinking about Gu Wenda's utilization of the mechanics of globalization in the positioning of himself as a contemporary Chinese artist. This is another project that was made by the artist Xu Bing, also a very well-known artist like Gu Wenda, as a contemporary Chinese transnational artist. But he's Beijing and New York based, but this project particularly focused on the city of Shanghai. And it started at Duke University, where Xu Bing was doing a residency, and he started carefully documenting and researching the tobacco trade as it happened in 1920s and 30s Shanghai, between Durham and Shanghai, and the British American Tobacco Company, which was a big funder with Duke University. So Xu Bing traces this economic history and the tensions that arose from it, and creates a series of installations and small pieces about this topic of tobacco. So this is a book made of tobacco leaves that's telling this history. We also see kind of his creation of paraphernalia, tobacco-related paraphernalia, like this pipe on the top, and then sort of looking at the way in which the tobacco trade also changed visual culture in Shanghai in the 1920s to 30s. So we look at the ubiquitous calendar posters and advertisements that were commonly found in spreads like Liangyo, the Young Companion Pictorial. He also kind of harkens to the jokes about socialism, such as this matchbook here that says, all communists are free to smoke, or even communists are free to smoke. So tobacco projects kind of more critically than some of the other worlding devices aims to draw parallels between contemporary Shanghai and the Shanghai of the 20s to the 30s. He writes that, because of tobacco projects so the first exhibition was in Duke, and then it moved to Shanghai, into a gallery there. And he says, because of tobacco projects to Shanghai, its central concepts subtly shifted relationship and China's globalization. In general, and its rapid development in China specifically. So he also does more than kind of conjure these parallels as they exist by, like Gu Wenda, but more straightforward about it, utilizing local labor to produce his work. So this is an image of a tiger skin rug that was part of the installation in Shanghai. So it's made out of cigarettes, thousands of cigarettes that are turned, upside down, so that the butt is up on some parts and the head of the cigarette is up on the other parts. So it makes this massive tiger skin rug. And Xu Bing hired migrant workers to open hundreds of packages of cigarettes, and then young art students to assemble them in this formation, and then documented this work as a way of engaging, critiquing, we can think about that, but exploiting local labor. And that's something that my future research plans are also really interested in looking at. I've been working with a lot of artists who are, I'm being exploited by them, working often for free, to kind of labor, local pieces. So this is something we can come back to. But I want to just end with looking at one project that's really epitomizing of this worlding phenomenon and the way in which contemporary art help promote Shanghai abroad, what it might mean, what kind of social, economic, and political tensions it might mask. Saigua Chang's Asia-Pacific Cooperation Cityscape Fireworks, which was a large-scale fireworks display that was commissioned for the close of APEC's annual conference in Shanghai held in 2001. Let's see. I'm going to actually play it for you. I'll just play this in the background as I conclude, and then I'll let you watch the rest. It's just a few minutes. So Saigua Chang's Apex Cityscape fireworks, like many contemporary Chinese works these days, are often talked about in relationship to the idea of East meets West and Shanghai's particular specificity of that trope. So it's celebrated for its East meets West elements, such as the pairing of Chinese imagery, like dragons, red lanterns, and the fireworks themselves, which are a Chinese invention, with Western frameworks for art, loosely defined as land art or large-scale installation art. My research, however, is interested in highlighting other forms of cultural hybridity that are at work, and as well as cultural that we see here, such as the artist's negotiation of his own transnational art star status with his local identity, as well as the meeting of China's socialist past with its capitalist present, evidenced by the sponsorship by APEC, which is of course, one of the chief engines, governmental engines, for the promotion of free trade in the Asian Pacific region. Like I said, with the case of Xintiandi, many of us kind of read this juxtaposition as really incongruous and strange, but for many in China, scholars and intellectuals, this is a reality of their everyday. So I just wanted to read a quote by the Beijing-based intellectual Wang Hui, who writes, "Two worlds become one, a global capitalist world. Although China's socialism did not collapse, as did the Soviet Union's or Eastern Europe's, this was hardly a barrier to China's economy from quickly joining the globalizing process in the arenas of production and trade. Indeed, the Chinese government's persevering support for socialism did not pose an obstacle to the following conclusion. In all of its behaviors, including economic, political, and cultural, China has completely conformed to the of capital and to the activities of the market." So I argue that works like Apex Cityscape Fireworks, rather than reveal celebratory East meets West encounters, show a powerful combination of a one-party regime and rampant capitalism, as well as I myself am able to identify the tensions between a Chinese artist working at a local level, as well as negotiating his own transnational art star status in the formulation of contemporary Chinese art practice. These kinds of tensions, furthermore shows, are not necessarily new, but have persisted in different particular guises throughout Shanghai's volatile 20th century history. And oftentimes these cases that I look at lie buried under the ruins of Shanghai's new heaven on earth. So my analysis of these key examples aims to give us a fuller idea of cultural collision as it exists in formulations of Chinese modernity, and look at also instances in which perhaps East did not meet West, in which it collided with West. So let me just give you the grand finale. Okay, thank you. So I'd like to open up to questions now.
So Andrew Griffin is going to walk the microphone around.
Yes, it's not because I'm going to ask a question.
It's inaugural. Walk around.
Jenny, thanks for a really stimulating and interesting talk. My question is, as you've been kind of wanting to complicate or rethink the model of East meets West, I wonder in any of your case studies if you've thought about East meets East, and in the way in which, say, in the 20s and 30s, perhaps, artists might have been thinking about issues of Pan-Asianism. I know this happens in India, and I wondered what kind of examples you might think about, or if you could just talk more about that, which I think is also in many ways fraught and might have some sorts of collisions that could parallel or build on the collisions you've been thinking about.
That's an
as well.
excellent question. Thank you for bringing that up. And the artist who most comes to mind as representative of that is Xu Beihong, who is a Chinese artist who had studied actually in France also. He studied at the Académie des Beaux-Arts and was importing academic realism into China. But he was a big promoter of Pan-Asianism as well and had exhibitions throughout India and really was a spearheader of that movement. And that, I would say that that's not very specific to Shanghai, which my project is, but definitely very important. And something else that's important is looking at the ways in which a lot of those artists and intellectuals had traveled, not to Paris, because only people usually of great means were able to do that, but oftentimes to Japan, if they're of medium means. And that's where they got their modernism kind of filtered, their European modernism filtered through the education system in Japan. And that's something that I think scholars raise to kind of specify the East meets West trope as well. Yeah. Thank you. But that's, yeah, it's very interesting. And also for the 90s to the present part, I can also just say that that kind of cultural hybridity, I think, lies not in this East meets West encounter so much as an overseas Chinese one. Yeah, the collaborations between people from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Chinese Americans born in the US, for example, with contemporary Chinese artists.
So I was wondering, when you mentioned the Soviet Union, it occurred to me, I mean, you were talking about the 60s, and I was just wondering if, similar to Eastern Europe, if because you were stressing a lot these official movements, and I wondered if there was an unofficial art movement in that.
Yes, that's a really good question. And sadly, a lot of the unofficial art violently suppressed, like I said. I mean, a lot of the artists who were not falling in line with that official art during the Cultural Revolution were literally, like the teachers of the young students were literally brought out into what the students designated as a pig pen area and beat publicly or forced to cook for the students and not allowed to make their work or destroyed their work. So a lot of that has been lost or was physically not able to have been made. But yes, there's a collaboration with the Soviets and Soviet instruction as well. A lot of Soviet instructors came over in the 50s and taught the principles of Soviet socialist realism. But interestingly, in addition to the Zhonghua China project, which was actually instigated not by Jiang Qing and Mao Zedong and her allies, but by the premier, who was also very popular at the time, Zhou Enlai, he promoted an other kind of art that's not that socialist realism, what he called export art. Because in 1972, when Nixon and these other officials, diplomatic officials, started coming, Zhou Enlai, who is more moderate, said, wait, we don't want to show them like this crazy socialist realist work paired with these dazabao, the big character posters littering our landscape. We want to show them more traditional Chinese bird and flower paintings and those kind of work. So he commissioned all these artists to produce those works, and then they got lambasted as hotel art by the officials and export art. So that is what I see as the most kind of unofficial that was being made at the time. But yeah, that is an important part of the picture.
And this is kind of a follow-up to Nina's question. What constitutes unofficial art today? And you had an image toward the end of, I'm not even going to pronounce his name.
Ai Weiwei.
That one, yes, that artist, and I know he's got some problem with taxes or something. So what's unofficial now, or what's unapproved, or what's censorship like?
That's a great question, and I have an image also I can use to answer it somewhere. Let's see. Yes, Ai Weiwei is definitely, I would say, one of the, he's the most well-known, and he's one of the only kind of unofficial artists of the day. There's, it's really interesting because a lot has changed in the past 2 decades, but sorry, I'm just hoping I can get to this one. Okay. A lot has changed in the past 2 decades. So after the 80s was a time of great artistic experimentation, and then in 1989, of course, the Tiananmen Square incident kind of quelled a pro-democracy movement as well as quelling artistic experimentation that was happening in the 80s. So a lot of those artists then left China, yeah? After the Tiananmen Square incident, a lot of them moved to the States, to Europe, et cetera. Just recently in the 2000s, the government has been inviting those figures back. And then figures like Sai Guochang, who lived in New York for 10 years, are now producing the Beijing Olympics fireworks display, right? So Ai Weiwei, this is from the Fuck Off exhibition that was staged in 2000 as a criticism of the Shanghai Biennale, which was also held in 2000. And the Shanghai Biennale was considered the first international art event, contemporary art event, and it was sponsored in part by the Ministry of Culture. And Ai Weiwei kind of staged this protest against it by creating this counter exhibition. When you get works more like by young women, by younger artists working in different media, like photography and video, and then Ai Weiwei's flipping off Tiananmen Square, kind of subversive works. So he's very much unofficial, but interestingly, Ai Weiwei has a really particular history with the Communist Party because his father, Ai Qing, was a very famous modernist poet. And during the Cultural Revolution, Ai Qing was banished to Xinjiang, the far western regions of China, and forced to clean a toilet for 10 years. And Ai Weiwei grew up seeing that. After the Cultural Revolution, his father was invited back and made the vice minister of culture. And so Ai Weiwei has really seen, I think, more clearly than any of the artists working today, the hypocrisy and the kind of sleights of hand that happen within the Chinese Communist Party, and is able to critique it, but then also recently got into trouble and arrested and kind of forced into silence, I think, most recently.
Thanks for your talk. I'm wondering, and I think you sort of gestured towards this in your history of the colonial history of Shanghai, but do you think that because of the sort of different kinds of colonial history in Shanghai versus, for example, Beijing,
Yes.
that sort of cultural hybridity that means something different, and then by extension, the artwork perhaps that is being created in Beijing versus Shanghai is in some way radically different? I was just there this summer, and there was the first Tino Segal
Right.
exhibition in Shanghai, and there were really interesting conversations with young artists there who in some way were rejecting Segal as a sort of artist and sort of wanting to actually go back to landscape painting and
Yes.
talking about how the sort of rudiments of the craft were so important, and that they wanted to reject the sort of more Western notions of what art can and should be. And so I guess there's a couple different questions
Yeah.
there, but like are there different sort of regionalisms popping up in China, and how do you understand that within this
Right.
history?
Yeah, absolutely. The first question, thank you for all those really good questions. The first one is is there a difference between the art that's coming out of Beijing and Shanghai, based particularly on Shanghai's semi-colonial history? And I would say yes, especially in the semi-colonial period. And that's something that writer Liu Xun, the revolutionary writer, theorized. He talked about in terms of patronage also, that in Beijing, because it was the historic capital of China and the dynastic capital and has a real long tradition of court painting and literati, the artists were supported by the dynastic system, whereas in Shanghai, they were supported oftentimes by foreign collectors and businessmen in the foreign concessions. And this is a kind of really stereotype of Shanghai versus Beijing, that Beijing is the seat of intellectualism and Shanghai is the seat of commercialism and finance, which is why a lot of art historians don't look at Shanghai, I think. But that said, I think in the contemporary moment, the proximities between late global capitalism and contemporary art, as I view them in China, have become so close, even in Beijing, that it's important to look at Shanghai and its history. So, yeah, and I have a really good friend, colleague who works on Beijing, and we always joke that, Beijing artists say, oh, we're very collective. They like to work in groups. They eat together, drink together, make work together. They still kind of carrying on the idea of collectivity as socialist collectivity, and that the Shanghai-based artists are very kind of more individualistic and more market-driven, perhaps. But then we always joke that they're all just market-driven. It's all about the money. That's the bottom line. But in terms of your second question, yes, this phenomenon of younger artists now returning to traditional Chinese landscape painting and traditional poetry is very, very much a reality that I see as well with a lot of my younger artist friends. I mean, even if they're producing things like photography and new media kind of experimental works that deal with issues of urban Shanghai, in their free time, they're always drinking tea, really old style pu'er cha, writing Chinese calligraphy and trying to write poetry. And they talk about it as something that they feel was robbed from them, that kind of cultural legacy that was called during the Cultural Revolution also, and a real desire to reconnect with that. Thanks. Does that answer with any? I forgot. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Yeah, Nancy?
I just wonder, do you talk, I mean, how much do you stress just the contemporary political landscape in China when you deal with the more recent part of your dissertation?
Right. Very much I do stress it, but I try my best to do it, as I can talk about it through the artworks that I discuss, and a lot of them really lend themselves to that. I mean, projects like Xu Bing's kind of looks at the contemporary landscape, sociopolitical landscape of Shanghai through the lens of this 1920s to 30s tobacco trade. So I talk very, explicitly about the contemporary situation and how it's reflected or critiqued or, in some cases, constructed in the works. In some cases, how are artists kind of engaging by utilizing, factory labor or by using artisanal labor, two very different things. But how are artists engaging the mechanics of globalization and the reality of China as the world's factory? Those are questions that I ask, and I try to give a very full picture of the reality based on the details of the artworks as they lend themselves to it. Does that make sense? Hannah, yeah.
So I had a MA student who wrote a paper on something called scar art. And yes. I'm wondering if maybe in connection to Nina's question and maybe also Lisa's, I'd love to know more about the interest on behalf of today's very commercially successful young artists or mid-career artists, even late career now, I guess.
Yes.
Sort of what their interest is in recuperating something of that time, either the sort of scar art material, but maybe also elements of social realism.
Yes.
I mean, some of the most interesting research happening on social realism looks for differences of style by location and person.
Right.
Maybe to think a little bit, could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, do I have images here as well? Socialist realism is really important in contemporary practice, and I can show you here some. Here are some of the key kind of, and these have become really kind of iconic symbols of defining contemporary Chinese art. But so this juxtaposition of the visual imagery of the Cultural Revolution, the propaganda posters like that we saw as depicted in Antonioni's film in the streets of Shanghai, get morphed, through a postmodern layering with advertisements for Coca-Cola and other international labels, as well as really explicit references to pop artists like Andy Warhol. And we have to think about kind of what are the differences between artists talking about art as a business now in contemporary China versus in the 60s when Warhol was doing it. We also have images that really directly reference Warhol's depictions of Mao, right? and his paintings of silkscreens of Mao in the 70s, now getting kind of re-articulated by painters. So yes, that's very important. And there's another Shanghai-based artist I didn't get to talk about, Zhou Tiehai, who, there he is looking grumpy in his studio, and he's become kind of known for these Joe the Camel paintings you see behind him. But he also talks about contemporary Chinese art as a legacy of Cold War politics, and thinking about the ways in which Chinese artists promote themselves outside of China as this kind of socialist other. So that's what you see up in the top left hand. Right. Wow, that's amazing. Yeah, sure. No, please.
I just have a question about the K-12 bits because I remember taking one class where there was sort of this, the whole Orientalism bit, and really thinking about how the German expressionist woodcuts were actually sort of from this sort of very cassette period and the sort of romanticization of sort of Japanese woodcut art form. And so I guess I'm wondering, it's sort of this weird East-West, who borrowed what from
Going
whom
back and
kind of
forth,
thing.
yes.
And then in the German Marxist tradition, sort of Brecht and all these people were really looking towards Mao
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Métis and all these things, and so much of their understanding of and reinterpretation of the dialectic is sort of through sort of Chinese communism.
Maoism,
and so
yeah.
I guess, how do we understand the arrow of
Yeah,
borrowing?
that's a really good point, and that's something that I really try to account for as well. So yeah, even the woodcut movement, while Lu Xun is constantly referencing German expressionist woodcuts, he also talks about Chinese culture and heritage being the inventor of woodcuts and the inventor of printing, right? So it is an attempt to really kind of fuse in his mind the two towards a new form of hybridity, and this is something for you, I think. This is from Antonioni's Zhonghua China. It's in Beijing on the Great Wall. Antonioni focuses for a long time on the image of this one young woman, and the narrator reads a quote from Bertolt Brecht's Questions from a Worker Who Reads. Who built the Thebes of the Seven Gates? In the books, you will find the names of kings. Did the kings haul up those lumps of rock? So yeah, so this is here we have Antonioni utilizing Brecht to think through Chinese socialism, and to also in Antonioni's mind, he really thought of it as perhaps wanted to think of it as a viable alternative to Western capitalism, and along with Godard and other intellectuals of the time, Barth, they were really thinking about Maoism as an alternative. So yeah, that is something that I really want to account for too in my research, and think about how and that's why I use an example also not only of local Chinese artists and foreign trained Chinese artists, but of foreign artists that are coming in and looking to China as well for artistic inspiration or influence.
In relation to that, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think J.G. Ballard's.
Yes, yeah.
Right. This is Shanghai, and it's amazingly vivid representation. Not unlike the unsanctioned or the disturbing images of the shipyards, and sort of it pours into black market and all kinds of things that are really. I mean, I have a lot of vivid imagery that you're kind of building on from that source. So I guess the question is, are there other are there key literary
non-Western, Western literary
you're looking
figures
at
that
film
are
and architecture, and I'm also curious, in terms of literature, are there reference points for you that are important?
Yeah, J.G. Ballard is a huge one, and I actually I'm trying to see if I had one quote that I was going to read and didn't get the chance to, in which he describes the collision of 1930s Shanghai of. He talks about kind of the sound that's emitted from nightclubs, the jazz music that's emitted is barely audible against the sound of bombings and beggars that are screaming and showing their wounds in the street for money. Kind of this, he really paints a picture of this very conflicted or multi-layered city in the 1930s. Yeah, so he's an important figure. Lu Xun is a literary figure, the leader of the League of Left-Wing Artists. He's considered China's first modernist novelist. And so he's a literary figure that I look very closely to, as well as, I look at a lot of literary figures that write within China, like Fei Xiaodong, who is a sociologist, but also kind of gave these very descriptive portraits of the city in its semi-colonial period. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Any other questions?
Okay, thank you very much.